Why is Taoism the most bastardized spiritual tradition and philosophy in the world? Now, in my new book, The Tradition of Natural Taoism, I go deep into why it's important to reclaim Taoism, in some sense, revive the tradition of Taoism. Now, some people may say, what do you mean by revive and reclaim the tradition? What do you mean? Isn't it still alive? Yes and no, right? The deeper aspects of the spiritual tradition are dying and are dwindling because of misinterpretation and misunderstanding, especially since Taoism went to other countries outside of China, and it's also been misunderstood and misinterpreted also in China as well. And so that was a big reason why I worked on this new book, The Tradition of Natural Taoism, is because I want people to understand Taoism as it truly is. Now, when I say bastardized, what do I actually mean by it's the most bastardized spiritual tradition in the world? Though we probably all do really know that, right? So as I said, to misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and misinformation due to bad translations of especially the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi texts. Now, the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi texts are the two main texts, you could say, of Taoism. And there are so many half-baked translations out there that a lot of people actually believe are accurate translations, and they are not. Sometimes these flawed translations have been stripped of their original meaning to cater to a Western audience, which is kind of sad, right? So they've been stripped of their original meaning to cater to a Western audience, to cater to the modern sensibilities of the time, and don't take in the time of the Warring States period of China when these great texts came about. And instead we try to modernize them and change them essentially to suit our modern sensibilities. But in the end, these inaccurate translations just distort the authentic meaning and intent of the sacred Taoist texts. So misinformation is eroding the essence of the Taoist tradition, which as a result creates an urgent need for clarity regarding what Taoism represents and what it essentially means to be Taoist. Now, to combat this, what I'm going to propose a little bit here may seem a little bit counterintuitive, right? So it may seem counterintuitive to the effortlessness of Taoism. But to combat a lot of this misinterpretation and misunderstanding, we have an urgent need for structure, which again, as I said, might be counterintuitive. But we live in a day and age where a little structure can help understand Taoism to its nth degree, and this is essentially needed to avoid a complete disfiguring of the spiritual tradition. It is essentially needed to, in some sense, to have some type of framework so we can understand this tradition, instead of people just saying, I'm going with the flow, dude, all of these catchphrases that have come from Taoism, and people think that that's actually what Taoism actually is. And Taoism is not just going with the flow, dude, and all of this new age BS that you hear. Now, some of this misinterpretation comes from some of the practices that were developed based on the Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi text, right? So based on both texts, you have a lot of schools of martial arts that had developed since that time, and also traditional Chinese medicine that developed because of those texts, right? And so then you have two branches that come out of both of those texts, which are Neidan, which is internal alchemy, and Weidan, which is external alchemy, right? And so this is how you have kind of the internal arts of martial arts and the traditional Chinese medicine aspect, all based in part on those two texts. And so because of that, a big problem has developed for thousands of years, and it's only become more prevalent in the modern day, due to the internet and so forth and so on. But the common problem is that, so for example, Tai Chi Chuan, right? Or what people commonly know as Tai Chi, the actual practice of the philosophy of Tai Chi is Tai Chi Chuan that people practice. And people think that if you practice Tai Chi Chuan or you practice Qigong, for example, this is what makes you Taoist. Now, that is like saying that someone who practices Hatha Yoga is a Hindu. Now, if you go to America, a lot of people don't even know that yoga itself isn't just Hatha Yoga, and a lot of people probably don't know that yoga itself is even related to Hinduism. If you can believe that, but it's a matter of a fact, right? And so same problem within Taoism is that people believe if they practice this form of spiritual cultivation or these spiritual practices, this is what makes them Taoism. And this is not what makes you Taoist. Sure, practicing Tai Chi Chuan, practicing Chinese medicine, Qigong, and this and that is good if you are practicing that in sync with Taoist philosophy. Obviously, your practice will get deeper and deeper and deeper because you have more of a framework. But if you're practicing it just as a dry spiritual practice in and of itself, then that may not go very far. And so the question is then, what is Taoism, right? If we have a need for structure, what is Taoism? And so in my book, I have a brief paragraph about what Taoism is. And what I state is that Taoism is essentially an attitude, behavior, and worldview shaped by nature and not human socialization. Some people have an inherent aptitude for Taoism and others need cultivation. Both depend on various factors: your genetic blueprint, your past life karma, your upbringing, culture, religious indoctrination, etc. So Taoism is basically a technology for deprogramming our mind from socialization so that we can finally return to our original nature. This is what Taoism is, right? It acts like a piece of technology. It is the ideology of no ideology, right? It brings you back to your original state, eliminating all of the socialization process that we've all endured, no matter whether that is good or bad, right? Obviously, there are some things that we pick up from our culture and this and that are very good and harmonious with the world, but there are other aspects that are negative and keep us bound to suffering, right? And so Taoism is that piece of technology, we could say, that deprograms our mind from all of that socialization process. And so to truthfully understand Taoism, or to be a Taoist, requires us to follow the way of nature, which actually runs counter to many religions and social beliefs. Hence, as I mentioned, the need for structure and understanding of Taoism to avoid such cultural appropriation, right? So a lot of people will mix Taoism with their spiritual tradition or with their social beliefs, and it becomes something that it actually isn't, right? A lot of people actually incorrectly believe Taoism has something to do with activism and morality and this and that. But Taoism is a tradition that highlights the immorality of morality, which again conflicts with a lot of people, particularly younger people, who have been trained to be activists, right? And who have been trained to have a personal agenda. Taoism pulls that rug from underneath all of us. So you have no personal agenda, you're not an activist, you understand that morality itself can be immoral, right? And this is what Taoism reveals as one of the highest spiritual teachings in the world. So as I said, one of the main reasons that Taoism is a bastardized tradition is that many people of certain cultures and religions and this and that just use Taoism as they see fit. And so unfortunately, Taoism then is treated as a secondary philosophy one applies to their religion, culture, or social disposition. And as a secondary philosophy, it becomes a victim of cultural appropriation and radical universalism, right? Taoism then gets lumped in with other religions and other spiritual traditions as if it is the same. And this is a big problem in the world, right? This is how people culturally appropriate other spiritual traditions to try and incorporate it in with theirs. And then there's this idea of radical universalism that all religions are the same, and no, they definitely are not. There are some that are more efficacious than others, and others that we could say don't benefit people in any way, really, with their hyper indoctrination and actually inhibit humanity and those people on a personal level. Where Taoism should not be a victim of cultural appropriation and radical universalism. And so Taoism should be understood in its historical context and not culturally appropriated or become victim of radical universalism. And so an example of understanding this is a story of Ava Wong, who is a Taoist practitioner and independent scholar. And in an interview, she was talking about the I Ching, right? The I Ching is an important text, particularly in Taoism, but has become victim of cultural appropriation and sometimes falls under the umbrella of radical universalism, right? And one of the more popular versions of the I Ching is Richard Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching, and it's one of my personal favorites as well. But what Ava Wong highlighted here was that Richard Wilhelm was influenced a lot by Jungian psychology, right? Carl Jung even wrote a foreword for Richard Wilhelm's translation of the I Ching. And Ava Wong's point here is that the I Ching cannot be seen through the lens of Jungian psychology. It has to be seen through the lens of Taoist thought. It has nothing to do, in some sense, with Jungian psychology, right? Obviously, you can relate anything to anything if you look close enough. But the I Ching should be seen in its own merit. It shouldn't be looked at through the lens of psychology. And so Wong was saying here that Wilhelm's translation is basically influenced by Jungian psychology. How much so is debatable, right? How much so is debatable. But her point is that it should be seen on its own merit and not measured by the lens that somebody has, which obviously can be difficult because we all do that to some degree. But can we know a tradition on its own of itself without having a tinge of conditioning influence our way of seeing that tradition? That's what basically Ava Wong's challenge was to all of us, right? Can we see the I Ching, for example, of itself without looking at it through a psychological or another religious lens, right? And so her point in the end is basically that the I Ching is not seen through the Taoist view, nor is it seen in its proper historical context, right? And so this is how we need to understand Taoism. We need to understand it in its proper historical context. The Tao Te Ching and the Zhuangzi text especially need to be understood in their proper historical context, translated correctly, and we need to also read the correct translations rather than the ones that are popular online. And so Taoism cannot truthfully be understood through any other religious lens, and it should not be a secondary philosophy, right? So no matter what religious or cultural or personal lens you have, it cannot be understood like that. Taoism needs to be understood with no filters. You need to understand Taoism with no conditioning. That's how actually the system will begin to benefit you. So if we understand Taoism in its historical context, then its philosophy will shine forth because we understand what circumstances gave birth to it, and what gave birth to it was the mind of the original Taoists. And when I say the minds of the original Taoists, who am I referring to? Well, I'm referring to the root of Taoism. Now, the root of Taoism are the two great masters of Taoism, Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi. This is how you can understand Taoism as it truly is, right? And this is how you can reclaim and revive Taoism if you study the accurate translations and you don't apply Taoism as a secondary philosophy to whatever religion you have. We don't do that with many other religions, right? A lot of people will not say that they're Christian, but then they're a closet Muslim, right? But often people will say that they're Christian or that they're Muslim and they follow Taoism. And it's like, well, Taoism kind of conflicts with both, to be honest. I mean, we have to point it out, right, that it conflicts with both. And so a lot of people will use it just as a secondary philosophy because it's comfortable for them, right? That's how they like to apply it. But my point in the tradition of natural Taoism, why not make Taoism a primary philosophy and spiritual tradition in your life rather than it being a secondary philosophy? And the way to do that is to follow Taoism as it truly is. And the root of following it as it truly is Zhuangzi and Lao Tzu. And why has humanity not accepted Taoism as it is? Because Taoism is a philosophy and spiritual tradition that accepts humanity as it is, accepts people being radically human, flaws and all, right? It's about being radically human, not being at odds with your own humanity, not creating stories in your mind that then inculcate guilt within you, right? It's about being radically human and being natural, being as nature wants you to be, so that you can just emulate the way of nature rather than emulating the way of an ideological belief. But being a natural human is a challenge. And Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi don't avoid this, right? Because most of us have been put through the ringer of socialization. And so most of us don't even know what our original nature is. Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi are not short-sighted here. They understand that. But their challenge to us is, can we accept Taoism as it truly is? And accepting Taoism as it truly is means that we accept ourselves as being radically human, right? Not trying to avoid our humanity, but leaning into our humanity. So by embracing our humanity, flaws and all, this is a massive difference between Taoism and most other religions, right? You're embracing our humanity. You're not making rules and laws that govern humanity, and you're not inculcating sin. You're accepting humanity for what it is. And so Taoism has no doctrine or form of indoctrination to impose on you. Rather, it is a technology to deprogram you from the indoctrination that you've experienced. And so to get to that stage, we have to accept Taoism as it truly is, and not adapt it to our own disposition to suit ourselves. A lot of people do that, right? They'll adapt a certain spiritual tradition to themselves in their own way, right? That's essentially what cultural appropriation is, rather than following the tradition as it is. And so don't do that. Taoism cannot liberate you if you don't follow it earnestly. And to follow it earnestly is to accept yourself as it is, right? The danger of Taoism is it tears down all man-made structures, and it tears down all religious ideological beliefs, particularly ideas such as sin, right? It just casts that aside and throws that away. And it throws it away for good reason, because these are undermining religious principles that inhibit a person from being their original nature, from being liberated in this life. And so Taoism just casts that aside and is there to teach you what is beyond ideological belief. What is our original nature as we truly are before the conditioning began at a young age, right? What was our original face before we were born, to use a Zen expression, right? Who were we before we were born, our original face? And so Taoism, in contrast to other religious traditions, is pushing humanity to evolve so that we can be radically human. It's not some transcendent philosophy about overcoming our humanity like some other religions teach, right? Other religions will teach us that we need to overcome our humanity because we're sinners and so forth and so on. Taoism is teaching us to be radically human. And so instead of fighting ourselves, instead of fighting our humanity, fighting each other, we need to lean into our humanity to push through the boundaries that divide us from each other and the Tao. This is what the Taoist tradition is teaching us, right? This is Taoism as it is. Taoism is about understanding your nature as it is with no filters. And this is a big reason why I wrote my book, The Tradition of Natural Taoism, is to bring it back, to revive and reclaim the tradition, to understand Taoism as it truly is. And it's obviously a lot more than that, right? I will continue to make more content on what my book is about. And if you're interested in my book, the link is in the pinned comment and in the description. But reclaiming Taoism was a big inspiration behind me even writing this book, right? And so I've only just gave you a little brief snippet of what it means to reclaim Taoism. And what it means to reclaim Taoism may seem counterintuitive, as I mentioned, with the need for structure, understanding it from its historical context, understanding the root of Taoism, and then accepting Taoism as it is. Because the time has come to finally accept Taoism as it is. Stop shaping it to your own personal disposition, your own cultural disposition, your own religious disposition. Accept Taoism as it is, and then it will work for you, because you will understand your nature with no filters as nature intended for you. Shanti, shanti, shanti.